President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I rise today for my 113th time to wake up speech on climate change. They say 13 is unlucky. I don't know what 113 is, but I do know what climate change is. It's very real. We shouldn't kid ourselves. And it's an urgent challenge for our country and our world. Our leading scientific organizations say so. Our national security leaders say so. All of our national laboratories say so. Major American businesses say so. And religious leaders of all faiths say so. Pope Francis certainly said so last week. But the Senate is jammed by persistent, meretricious climate denial. The denial comes in many guises, but like a compass, all the denial points in the same direction. Whatever helps the fossil fuel industry keep polluting. That's the true north of climate denial. Whatever helps the fossil fuel industry. Look at the fossil fuel money pouring into the Republican Party and tell me this is a coincidence. We have senators who deny that anything is happening, who say that it's a hoax. We have senators who deny that we can solve this. We have senators who deny their faith in the American economy to win if we innovate. We have senators who simply shrug and say, I'm not a scientist. And a bunch of senators say, don't even worry about it. Climate change has stopped. The junior senator from Florida tells us, and I quote, despite 17 years of dramatic increases in carbon production by humans, surface temperatures on the Earth have stabilized. The junior senator from Texas proclaims, and I quote him, satellite data demonstrate for the last 17 years there's been zero warming, none whatsoever. Let's leave aside for a moment the cherry-picked data that this conclusion is based on, which leaves out the oceans, which cover a mere, 70% of the Earth's surface. I'll get back to oceans in a minute. But even this cherry-picked data needs a trick to deny the long-term trend. Using their trick, you could convince yourself that climate change has stopped 6 times in the history of this increase from 1970. It's easy to do. You pick a spot here, and you pick a spot there, and in the variability, you make it a flat line, and you say there. You see? A pause. The problem is, these manufactured pauses keep climbing. When this bogus climate pause idea was trotted out in an op-ed in the Providence Journal, my home state paper, PolitiFact quickly determined that it uses, and I quote them, cherry-picked numbers and leaves out important details that would give a very different impression. When you look at the linear trend for this whole data set from 1970 to 2013, no one can deny the Earth is warming. Research shows that climate change is marching on. The past decade was warmer than the one before that, which was warmer than the one before that. 17 of the 18 hottest years in the historical record have occurred in the last 18 years. NOAA and NASA count 2014 as the hottest year on record, and so far 2015 is on track to be even hotter than 2014. Fluctuations do not statistically alter a trend. It is a disservice to the truth and to this Senate to suggest that this heralds the end of climate change. As noted UC Berkeley physics professor Richard Muller put it, when walking upstairs in a tall building, it's a mistake to interpret a landing as the end of a climb. Plus, for what reason would it have stopped? There's no basis for the pause. We know why it's happening. Global warming is caused by carbon pollution. We've known that science since Abraham Lincoln wore a top hat around this town. That's not news. And our carbon pollution sure hasn't stopped. We just broke 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere for the first time in the history of the human species. So there's no intellectual basis behind the pause theory. And these claims of a climate change pause have been debunked. Just a couple of weeks ago, researchers from Stanford University published a study. To quote their findings, there is no hiatus in the increase in the global mean temperature, no statistically significant difference in trends, no stalling of the global mean temperature, and no change in year-to-year temperature increases, end quote. In other words, no pause. A different study prepared for the U.S. Climate Variability and Predictability Program reviewed this so-called pause data and said this, it, quote, not only failed to establish a trend change with statistical significance, it failed by a wide margin, end quote. Any argument that global warming stopped 18 or 20 years ago is just hogwash, said one of that report's authors. Just hogwash. When legitimate scientists and statisticians examine the data for global mean temperature, they don't find any so-called pause. This chart shows average global temperatures since the late 1800s, which is about the time that we began burning fossil fuels in the Industrial Revolution. In yet another study out this month, researchers did a little test. They showed this chart to 25 economists, but instead of temperature, they told the economists that the chart showed world agricultural output. That stripped the data of any political baggage of climate change. It made this a simple statistical question. Does this chart show that the measured phenomenon, climate change, temperature, world agricultural output, does this chart show that whatever the measured phenomenon is, stopped in 1998? Well, the economists looked, and they flat out rejected that conclusion. What they agreed was that claiming the phenomenon had stopped would be misleading and ill-informed. So, why did this pause theory appear? That is a mistake, that is hogwash, that is based on cherry-picked numbers, all towards a conclusion that is misleading and ill-informed. Why? Why? Because the big carbon polluters and their allies in Congress don't want us to act. So we keep getting this mischief fed to us. The enterprise that performs that evil task of feeding mischief into this debate is perhaps the biggest and the most complex racket in American history. It's phony. They cherry pick a handful of statistically insignificant data points and tell us the whole problem went away on its own. Then the real scientists take a look at it and say, that's bunk. But in the meantime, the polluter enterprise notched a public relations victory. It bought some time to keep polluting for free, and sadly, it got some of our colleagues to be party to it. Telling the American people there's a pause in global warming may lull the gullible to sleep, but it's phony, it's inaccurate, and it's wrong. It ignores the truth, it ignores the science. Basically what it is cheesy fossil fuel PR dressed up in a lab coat to look like science. Just enough to fool people that little bit. So now let's turn back to the oceans, that 70% of the Earth's surface that the other data left out. These data show the decades-long warming of the surface oceans, 1960 to 2010. No pause. Remember, the deniers conveniently left all this data out when they cherry-picked their pause data. 70% of the Earth's surface left out. Mr. President, the first law of thermodynamics, conservation of energy, decrees that all of that heat in the ocean had to come from somewhere. Research shows that greenhouse gases trap excess heat in the atmosphere, and that over 90% of that excess heat went into the oceans, was absorbed by our oceans. People who insist that the climate has not warmed in recent decades ignore this one little thing. The oceans, which cover 70% of the surface of the Earth. The oceans don't lie. This warming is changing the oceans and our fisheries. And water expands when it warms. That's the law of thermal expansion, unless somebody wants to come and deny that. So, the seas are rising across the globe. In Rhode Island, we measure it at the Newport Naval Station tide gauge. Basically, it's a glorified yardstick. It's not complicated. There's no theory involved. It's a measurement. And it says we're up nearly 10 inches since the 1930s. That may be funny to landlocked states, but when there's 10 more inches of sea to be thrown against your shores by a big ocean storm, coastal states take that stuff very seriously. NASA measures it around the world with satellites. It's not just the coastal stations that take these measures. NASA measures from satellites. And we measure the exploding acidity of the seas. The exploding acidity of the seas is directly related to CO2 absorption, unless people want to deny chemistry. You can put CO2 in seawater in a high school lab, and you can make the pH change. That's what we're doing on a global scale. And we don't get to repeal laws of chemistry around here, no matter how powerful the special interest. Last week, His Holiness Pope Francis called on us to work together to protect our common home. He warned us in his recent encyclical, those who will have to suffer the consequences of what we are trying to hide will not forget this failure of conscience and responsibility. But first, we have to want to protect our common home. If what we want to protect is the fossil fuel industry, at all costs, at any cost, we need a priority adjustment. Mr. President, in our rotten, post-Citizens United, billionaire special interest politics, perhaps the Pope would have had more effect if he had a super PAC. But it shouldn't take a super PAC for us to heed the Pope's warning, or to heed the science, or to heed our national security leaders, or to heed everyone else who has lined up to try to wake us up. Pope Francis also said that to avert the most serious effects of the environmental deterioration caused by human activity, now is the time for courageous actions and strategies. And the New York Times today reports many conservative Republicans believe climate change is a real threat. Once you get away from this building and the pernicious influence of the fossil fuel industry and its relentless money and threats, it's not a question of ideology, it's a question of special interest influence. And conservative Republicans increasingly understand that this is real. 11 of them just broke ranks in the House. So it's time. It's time to come together in good faith to tackle this real and persistent threat, the threat of climate change. It is time, Mr. President, for us to wake up. I yield the floor.